Welcome back. I'm going to discuss conflict theory. So conflict theory is a macro-sociological theory that answers questions such as, why are some people poor and other people very rich? Now, many of you may think about these two questions as in the terms of individualist responses. Perhaps one person worked harder than another. But conflict theory looks at things differently. It takes a more structural approach to this question, and is going to say that exploitation is the key factor in deciding who's going to be poor and who's rich. But who exploits who? This is a class-related question. One class owns the means of production and another class does not. The class that owns the means of production, or the capitalist class, then hires out labor, looks for labor powers, and somebody has to provide that. And those who provide it are part of the working class or the proletariat. And there's this fundamental conflict between the two in the sense that the capitalist class would like to get as much labor for as little as possible, and the worker would like to give less labor for more. That makes sense. But in order to be hired, the worker has to provide more than what he or she is given. This creates conflict over resources in the workplace, and hence conflicts over labor time. But conflict theory deals with various types of conflicts in terms of race, in terms of gender, and so forth. But fundamentally, conflict theory says that society is held together by social power, because different groups act within their interests, and it is the fight for these different interests that then end up settling who's going to get what in society, why some populations are poorer and disadvantaged relative to the others, since the political institutions will enforce this economic reality. And that's why it's fundamentally a materialist idea as opposed to an idealist concept. So the idea of materialism and idealism are something I talk a little bit about in intro, and you understand much more about in classes on sociological theory. The fundamental idea of materialism is not this idea of wanting to get more for myself, but an explanation of how our society is structured. And it says that it's the dominant economic interests that have control over the dominant media systems and the systems that help socialize us into a particular way of thinking. So whether it's educational institutions or whether it is political institutions, religious institutions, those ideas that become dominant, the ideologies that become dominant in these systems have to be in agreement with the interests of the dominant class, or because the dominant class is fighting for those ideas in order to maintain its power and its legitimacy. Those are some of the fundamental ideas in conflict theory. So it argues that the struggle over society's resources influences all other social institutions, not then to say that religion determines economics, which is a Weberian idealistic idea. So that's very fundamentally different than a conflict theorist perspective. So they also would argue that social inequalities will lead to conflict and change. Well, how does this happen in the scenario that I presented to you just a moment ago? Well, in this case, the working class may organize, for instance, form unions, fight for higher wages, fight to get different people in political office and power, fight to change, maybe get access to a particular channel and change and transform ideas among the population in order to better serve the interests of the poor and working people. Or you could have a revolution and other sources, or you can have a very reactionary counter-revolution. All of those things can happen in terms of conflict theory, or that's the way conflict theorists would approach it. So, the focus here is on the disparities in wealth, power, and privilege. So, in this sense, we have the capitalist class in the United States and in the world that has most of the wealth concentrated. If we can look at how inequality has happened in the globe, we see global inequality that 42 people have roughly the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the planet. Right? You can look at Oxfam's latest report on inequality, and you'll see that the 42 wealthiest people in the world have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the planet. So this demands explanation, and that is an explanation that conflict theorists are focused on. And certainly that does not result from equalities of power or privilege, nor does it lead to greater egalitarian structures in power and privilege. This inequality is largely racially correlated, particularly in the United States, and there's different structures and ways that racial inequality manifests itself. That's another focus of a sociology class on race and ethnicity, and certainly that's an important element to conflict theory as well. So we can really narrow down conflict theory into a couple of central questions. One is, who benefits from the given arrangement, the current arrangement? Who's affected by this arrangement? How does it hurt certain groups, and how do certain groups benefit or classes benefit? And how are these inequalities maintained? So here the role of the political structure is really important. This is why conflict theorists will look at an analysis of imperialism. We want to understand, why do we have so many bases, military bases, all over the world? You have roughly over 1,000. Years ago I was hearing 700. Now I'm hearing over 1,000. And that's not just out of the goodwill of certain planners and so forth to make the world quote unquote safe for democracy. Conflict theorists are going to say this is how inequalities are maintained. It is through imperial power and through the power of the state that these inequalities may be maintained, and otherwise also through hegemonic ideologies. So those are really the focus of conflict theory. And important to understand that conflict theorists don't just focus on issues of class, although that is central. They also want to see how class intersects with gender, how class intersects with race, and so forth. So those would be the feminist and race conflict theories. And there's also a section of conflict theory that's really focused on economic cycles and economic crises that stems from a Marxian analysis, as lots of conflict theorists does stem from Marxian analysis. So take a look here on inequality. The Gini coefficient is a number between 0 and 100, or in this case 0 and 1, sometimes you can multiply it by 100. And 0 means perfect equality. There's no inequality in the society. Everybody gets the same amount. Now that doesn't say it's ideal, just say it's absolute, or they call it perfect. And then perfect inequality is the opposite scenario. One person has everything and nobody else has anything. So that's what this measure is telling us. And then if we look at this graph here in front of you, you can see the inequality in U.S. households from roughly 1967 up through 2009. And what you see is a steady increase in the Gini coefficient, or a measurement of inequality, showing that the United States is becoming fundamentally more and more unjust, more and more unequal. And so it's getting harder for people to move up the economic ladder, because as inequality increases, opportunities to move up decrease. Social mobility decreases because the wealth is becoming more and more concentrated at the top, and poverty is becoming more widespread at the bottom in terms of the distribution of resources. Now, growing inequality can happen in terms of expanded consumption as products and so forth, as their prices decrease. But for the most part, what you see when you see a highly unequal society is highly unequal life chances on one hand, or throughout the society. So one segment of society has low infant mortality, high life expectancy, and the other is the opposite. So you start to see big differences in terms of health, big differences in terms of wealth, differences in terms of educational opportunities, and so forth, as well as, of course, standard of living.